We have decided to keep a record of this talk. So for this reason, we are going to share this notice and to record today's talk with Angela Santese and me. I am Umberto Tulli, researcher at the School of International Studies. Angela is a historian from the University of Bologna. She wrote a great book on the anti-nuclear movement during the 80s and how the American anti-nuclear movement was able to shape the public and political debate within the United States and Ronald Reagan's foreign policy vis-a-vis nuclear weapons and the end of the Cold War. But today, instead of talking about our research interests, we are going to talk about the November elections, the presidential elections, and the other elections that took place in November. In our division of labor, we have decided to, just one sec, sorry. In our division of labor, we have decided that I will give a few introductory remarks and I will touch upon a few controversial points, especially for what we have seen and what we have been listening to from the Italian media, while Angela will try to explain us how Americans casted their votes. So she will do the smart political and analyst part of today's talk, analyzing flows and trends. And eventually, should we have time, we will talk a little bit about future perspectives for American foreign policy and the United States in the world. So, keeping it as short and as clear as possible, there are several issues to talk about these elections. Despite the fact that Biden won, as many have predicted actually, there are a few things that seem to challenge what we expected from this election. Indeed, I will point out three major surprises. The first is that we expected a huge blue wave, a huge triumph for Joe Biden and the Democrats, but in reality things went different, especially if we take into consideration that the presidential election was just one among other elections. The vote was about the presidency, and indeed Biden won, but the vote was also for the House of Representatives, and Democrats had lost the vote. They will have the smaller majority since the Second World War, the smallest majority since the Second World War. They had lost about 10, 12 seats. The vote was for the Senate, and Democrats had lost Alabama, as it was expected. The one in Colorado and Arizona, again, this was something that was in the air, but most pundits and political analysts believe that the Democrats could win in North Carolina, in Maine, and actually they have lost in both North Carolina and Maine, which remained and went to the Republicans. The elections was for 11 governors, state governors and state congresses, with more than half of lower chambers and about 60% of state senates, and nothing really changed in these elections. Republicans and Democrats confirmed their positions, but actually the Democrats spent a lot of money to win state elections, and they tried to win in Texas, North Carolina, and Florida, but in the end they have lost in Texas, North Carolina, and Florida. There were more than 100, about 125, 26 referenda. Some of them were quite important, actually. One is the referendum in Florida on the minimum wage. Another one, which I like a lot, and I will talk about it in a few minutes, was a referendum in Colorado about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So, first surprising point, the Democrats did not win, did not receive a large victory as we expected. Second surprising point, turnout and participation. Turnout was really huge Americans went to vote by large numbers. We still don't know how many Americans voted. We still don't know the exact number of votes casted in these elections, but we expect something in between 66% or 67%, which is a huge difference if we compare this number with all the previous presidential elections. More or less, all the previous elections were around the 55%. I have some data here in 2016, 55%, in 2012, 54.9, 2008, 58.2. And this huge turnout changed everything because pollsters actually expected an increase in turnout and participation, but the provision, the idea was that it would be around 60%. And we can try to understand this large turnout by highlighting that the vote was a sort of referendum on Donald Trump and the idea of America that Donald Trump embodied. And the large majority of Americans rejected this idea. Again, we are still waiting for the definitive numbers, but when Americans will end counting the votes, we expect that Biden will win with a 6 to 7 million votes of difference. Third surprising point, these numbers, these large numbers, tell us also another fact, which is the fact that Republicans increased their votes, which is something that most scholars, pundits, politicians did not expect, mostly because of some demographic trends within the United States, but also for some aspects related to what it is generally called identity politics. So, despite the large majority in popular vote and the clear majority in the Electoral College that Joe Biden has, the electoral outcome is quite problematic. As I have said, we expected a large democratic victory in all the levels of the elections, in all competitions, especially for three reasons. The first one is, put it quite simple way, the COVID crisis. The terrible handling of the crisis by the federal government with more than 11 million cases and about 250,000 deaths led us to suppose that probably most Americans would endorse the Democratic platform. Second point, the narrative about Trump's economic success, which was quite really radical and popular, but at the same time, over the last few months, it entered crisis. The Federal Research Office, officially known as FRED, Federal Reserve Economic Data, I think, published some data and some trends about the American economy that show that on a general level, Trump consolidated some positive trends for the American economy that started before he took office, but there were also two negative trends that emerged. The first one is a general reduction in working class median wage, which is something which is particularly important in the so-called Rust Belt. So states like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Illinois. But there is also another data, which is the trade deficit of the United States. In August 2020, the trade deficit rose to the highest level in 15 years. With all due respect to Donald Trump's rhetoric and actions to protect the American market and to favor the American reindustrializations, it seems that something went wrong from this perspective. Third reason why we expected a large democratic victory. Well, I would say that Black Lives Matter movement and the idea that it would trigger Black Americans' participation and voting behavior in favor of the Democratic Party proved to be only partially correct. My impression, but again, I'm talking about a quite personal impression, I don't know if Angela agrees with me, is that The Black Lives Matter movement increased blacks and minorities participation, but at the same time it also fueled the opposite reaction because the movement targeted police violence and racism, but according to recent polls we have, police is still the most reliable institution within the United States. American citizens trust police more than Congress, the White House, or judges. So the Black Lives Movement triggered also law and order reactions that brought votes to the Republicans. So the final vote was different from what we expected. But my impression, actually it's a quite common impression, is that the vote was problematic also because of the controversies about the vote itself. Most of these controversies have been raised by the incumbent, Donald Trump, who has been talking about electoral frauds, actually started in July and in August to talk about possible eventual electoral frauds. And as you probably know, there is no evidence about these alleged electoral frauds. From what we know, this election has registered a very low number of disputed votes. So how can we explain this emphasis and this noise on the electoral fraud? I will try to offer you a threefold explanation. One is that Mr. Trump, President Trump, cannot afford to lose. There are more than a dozen investigations against Mr. Trump. I've checked the numbers this morning, and according to the New York Times, there are already 12 congressional investigations, 10 federal criminal investigations, and 8 state and local investigations against the president, the former president. The White House offered him a presumptive immunity from prosecution, but now he has to face these guys. And new problems will probably arrive over the next few months. For example, in September, last September, the New York Times reported a few information about Donald Trump's tax declarations, something that the president never revealed. In Italy, we have been talking about the fact that he doesn't pay federal taxes, but the scoop, the New York Times scoop, was the fact that he has debts with millions of dollars debts with foreign societies. And I think that Congress will investigate on this because many pundits, many scholars, many politicians believe that the very fact that the President of the United States could have received money from abroad is a huge national security problem. One of the charges that Donald Trump used in 2016 against Hillary Clinton was that her husband received money from abroad for his foundation, the Bill Clinton Foundation, and so Hillary couldn't become president because she would be actually too dependent and sensitive to foreign interests. We have a second problem, which is the fact that Mr. Trump himself, his personality, and his relationship to the Republican Party creates some problems for the acceptance of this electoral outcome. Over the last 4 years, we became familiar with Trump's style and Trump's lack of any institutional practice and political respect. During the electoral campaign, he claimed he does not know what losing means. And to some extent, we have perceived and we thought that Trump is a huge anomaly for the United States. But at the same time, Mr. Trump is fully within an American political tradition. Let me be clear on this point. In 1964, after radical right candidate Barry Goldwater won the Republican nomination, a historian, Richard Hofstadter, published an article in Harper's Magazine, which later became a book. The title of the book is The Paranoid Style in American Politics, in which he investigated the influence of conspiracy theories on American history and on throughout all the elections within the United States. And over the last 10, 15 years, I would say, the Republican Party benefited a lot from several strange conspiracy theories that emerged in the public debate within the United States. I'm not kidding. I'll go back to this point in a few minutes, but for the moment, for now, the emphasis on this point, on this paranoid style, helps us understand that Donald Trump is not such a strange phenomenon that came out of the blue, and that being at the White House for 4 years, he succeeded in projecting a shadow over the Republican Party. This point is a further problem because, and this is probably the most important one, the one that many pundits and scholars have been discussing in these 2 weeks, and it can be summarized with the idea of a huge, really huge political polarization in American society and in American politics. I would say that over the last 12, 16, maybe 20 years, this has produced a radicalization of both parties along the lines of the identity politics. For the Democrats, it means that identity politics means that the Democratic Party has tried to portray itself as a pluralist party and to broaden its electoral base and base. So, for example, the emphasis on minorities, women, young, educated electors, the emphasis on civil rights and the new civil rights. For the Republican Party, this polarization was above all a radicalization, a tilt toward the right. The right wing of the party became more relevant, actually, more influential. This is the outcome of several processes. On the long run, we can see the culture wars of the 60s, of the 70s and 80s, with a huge split within the American society over some sensitive issues such as gay rights, abortion, the role of religion in public education. Please consider that since 2008 in Florida and in Louisiana, creationism has been taught in public schools. But these were political struggles, which at the time were embraced by a minority, such as the evangelicals or some Catholic groups. But evangelicals, according to the census, now represent about the 30% of the American population, and Catholics, the 20 to 23%. These issues, actually, these controversial issues, became part, over the last 10, 15 years, became part of the Republican platform and Republican identity. They are really important for the Republican Party. In the short run, we have seen many original conspiracy theories, actually, that were fueled by some Republican candidates, because it was convenient to do so, because at the White House there was a Democratic president. So, for example, the idea that President Obama was a non-American Muslim, and so that he was a sort of a usurper, an abusive tenant at the White House, was extremely successful. Probably many among you will remember the fact that in 2011, during the electoral campaign, Obama was forced to produce his birth certificate. More recently, actually, there was a similar phenomenon with QAnon. I don't know if you are familiar with Patriota Q, QAnonymous, this conspiracy theory which supposed the existence of a global plot of Satan worshipper pedophiles led by Hillary Clinton, Soros, and Angela Merkel against Donald Trump, which sounds ridiculous and something really incroyable, something really out of any political good sense. But according to the Washington Post and to Forbes, in August, about 60% of Republicans believe that there is something true in this conspiracy theory. So this ideological polarization, I'm spending a lot of words on this ideological polarization because I think that it is quite important now after the November vote for two reasons. The first one is the idea of a stolen victory. The problem is not that Mr. Trump is not recognizing the electoral results. The problem is that we have a few million Republicans who believe that there was an electoral fraud. A noisy and well-organized part of the Republican Party, which is pushing the entire Republican Party toward the right, far right. Indeed, if you look at the reactions to Trump's recent words on the stolen elections, only a few important Republicans dissociated themselves from the president's words. For example, Georgia governor or Vermont governor. If we want to broaden this point, which is probably the most important thing to do, the problem is that there are two different groups with two different ideas of what America should be. And each group does not recognize the legitimacy of the counterpart. So to Republicans, Democrats are a sort of traitor and a threat to national democracy and national security. But to Democrats, Republicans are the same. They are traitors and a threat to American democracy. I have used the word traitors because during the electoral campaign, Trump said that it was time to execute Hillary Clinton for treason and to convict Obama for treason, while many Democrats use the same expression to describe Trump. Donald Trump is a traitor of our national democracy. A second consequence of this growing polarization within the United States has to do with what will happen in the foreseeable future. One political scientist a few decades ago defined the American institutional division of power as separated institutions that share powers. And to work American democracy and legislation actually needs that the White House and Congress have a dialogue. Otherwise, legislation stops. Now, with a divided government, with a very thin Democratic majority in the House and eventually in the Senate, we still don't know because in Georgia there will be a new election in January. The White House will have to fight, to struggle a lot to pass legislation. The alternative is governing and ruling through executive orders, something that Trump, Obama, Bush did, something that probably Biden will do, which is legitimate actually, but it entails two problems. The first one has to do with the fact that an abuse in executive orders is a problem for the democratic accountability of legislation. The second one is a problem of effectiveness of legislation because executive orders can be easily interpreted and implemented in very creative ways by state governors or state legislators. In addition, executive orders can be easily overridden by judges, federal courts. And this is a further problem because Donald Trump was quite successful in appointing judges during his 4 years at the White House. We read a lot about the fact that Donald Trump appointed 3 judges at the Supreme Court, But in addition, he also appointed 53 judges to the Courts of Appeal, and I think about 165, 66 judges to district courts, more than Obama did in 8 years. And judges will easily stop and modify an executive order Biden will sign. One last point, maybe two actually. This growing polarization has entered a dysfunctional political mechanism. Over the last months, we have seen and listened to scholars, pundits, and journalists talking about the non-democratic feature of the United States. Last week, a quite important Italian journalist said that the United States was founded as a non-democratic republic, which is of course an exaggeration, but there are several problems with the functioning of the American democracy, and these elections actually show them quite clearly. The most important one is the Electoral College mechanism. Each state has a certain number of electors who are supposed to elect the American president. This system creates some problems because the outcome of the Electoral College could be different from the outcome of the popular vote. This happened twice since 2000. For a couple of days, we thought that this scenario could apply also to this election. And this is a problem. This is something that many Americans are today contesting. Indeed, at the beginning, I was talking about the referendum in Colorado, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is an attempt to bypass this problem. It is an agreement among American states to give their electors to the candidate who received the majority in the popular vote. For the moment, this agreement has been ratified by 14 or 15 states, which represent about 190 electors in the Electoral College. But my impression is that this initiative is to some extent doomed to fail for a number of different reasons. We have a problem with minority rule within American institutions, but time is running very fast, so I will skip this point. There is a further problem which is becoming increasingly important, which is voter suppression and exclusion. Again, long story short, but Americans' voting rights can change substantially from state to state. Registration, perfect match, ID laws, and these measures have been contrasted over the last years, especially since the last midterm congressional elections. And this is one of the reasons why absentee vote and vote by mail this year was so important. Of course, the other reason is the fact that there was the COVID crisis. This is my last point, then I will leave the floor to Angela. Postal voting and postal votes, because my impression is that the Italian media presented them as something really obscure and something really strange. Contrary to what we have listened to in the last few days and weeks, postal voting was not a Democrat's invention to steal the election, but it is something quite common in the United States, which started after the Civil War, during the Civil War, with Abraham Lincoln introduced postal voting. Then after the 1970s, it became increasingly popular. Today, actually, since the last elections, postal voting is the only possible way to cast the vote in 5 American states. This year, postal voting was central for 3 reasons. Most states invited people, their citizens, to vote by absentee tools such as postal voting because of the COVID crisis. Indeed, the US Election Assistance Commission, which is a federal agency which gives instructions to Americans on how to cast their votes, predicted in August a huge increase in postal voting, an increase about a 40% increase. Second reason why postal voting was and is central is the fact that it reversed the electoral outcomes in Pennsylvania and Georgia, thus fueling polemics and problems, but in reality it is nothing strange. Actually, it was expected to reverse the vote in both Pennsylvania and Georgia, and actually it was also expected to reverse the vote in North Carolina and in Ohio, something that did not happen. I'm saying that it's not so strange because the Democratic Party has a long tradition of inviting people to vote by postal, by the vote by mail, in part because of an ideological reason, which is the fact that Democrats trust the federal government and the postal service. Another reason, which is less naive, is the fact that postal voting allows to overcome some voter suppression measures. Final point on the postal voting, it was the target of Republicans. Criticism, even before the vote actually, Donald Trump started to criticize postal voting to cast doubts on votes by mail because he claimed that it opened the door to many frauds. However, according to the Heritage Foundation, which is an ultra-conservative think tank which is collecting a huge database on electoral frauds and disputed votes, vote by mail is the safer solution that the United States, that American citizens have to cast their vote. And by comparing all the disputed votes and all the controversies about votes since the year 2000, I think, this data show that any fraud attempt was small scale and was unable to modify the outcome of the election. So my impression, and I will conclude with this sentence, is that it's just a political strategy with very limited, concrete side and aspects. Thank you. Angela, please.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank both Umberto and also Professor Fracasso for the kind invitation. As Umberto said, I will analyze some elements that emerged from the vote and that tell us something, especially about polarization, not only, which is a polarization not only from the ideological point of view, but also from the geographic point of view. And with this, I mean that different parts of the country voted in a really different way, and which is also polarization if we take into account the distribution of the wealth, the distribution of the income of the people that actually casted their vote for the Republican on one side or for the Democratic Party on the other. And as Umberto just told us, the Democratic victory is not a surprise, but the surprise are instead those related to the Democratic defeat in the House. And for me, above all, the surprise is it was Donald Trump's ability to expand his electoral base by 5 million votes. And the unprecedented participation in the vote actually did not translate into the blue wave that some pundits, commentators, and political analysts were actually expecting. But basically, the result was to have two huge waves headed in very different opposite direction. And The real surprise was the president's ability to maintain such a high consensus despite his divisive message, his confrontational and also racist rhetoric, the scandals of the administration, and also the the way in which he basically handled or not handled the coronavirus disaster. And so this election, notwithstanding that, and given the difference in the result, if we take into consideration from one side the outcome of the presidential election, and on the other, the outcome in the House, but also in the state races, is that this election can be considered the defeat of Trump as president, but at the same time cannot be considered the defeat of Trumpism. And this point is, of course, related to the polarization of the American political and social system. And for this political and social system, this polarization basically was the cause, but at the same time the outcome of the national populist message of the president. So I am going to analyze some element, and I really want to underline that we are speaking about provisional data because they are still counting the vote because of the postal vote which Umberto just made reference to. And I want also to underline another point. Joe Biden, for his part, has succeeded in his intent. I mean, he was, his choice to choose to keep a sober profile, to use calm tones, and his unifying message paid off, not in absolute term, but for what was the candidate primary aims, it was a success. I mean, Biden was able to take back to Trump those states which Trump won by a fraction in 2016. These states are actually Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which are part of the faithful blue wall, that is the state that Democrats basically were able to win between 1992 and 2012. And so the first element is that, as Umberto told us, it was the most participated election of the last 120 years. And here, the really important element is that the increase in electoral participation has happened in all states, not only in those states that were in balance. For example, there are significant increase. There are significant increase in participation, even states where the result was obvious, and among those imbalance, for example, are those of the new emerging Latin blocs that have known a significant increase in participation, for example, Nevada, Texas, and Arizona. And Arizona, the latter, has become democratic for the second time since 1952. And in Arizona, the percentage of participation in the vote grew about 11% if compared to the previous presidential race. And in Texas, this increase was almost around 9%. always compared to the election of 2016. The second point I want to touch is related to the demographic groups and their and in the way they decided to cast their vote. The message of Biden in this regard has worked less in convincing Hispanic and Afro-Americans. And I mean, exit polls suggest that both groups, yes, have chosen the Democrats with a very large majority, but in a slightly lower percentage than in 2016. And these, I mean, the problems in mobilizing the votes of Hispanics and of Afro-Americans has to do also with the lack of a real election campaign that, for example, was in some ways undermined the possible effect of Kamala Harris' choice as deputy. And the same can be told about the lack of rallies, I mean, of real rallies that had also made the use of Obama and other prominent figure that actually were supposed to be capable of intercepting voters from this community. All this was less effective than, I mean, pundit and political analysts were expecting. And perhaps also Biden, in order to speak to Latino, maybe was supposed to use a less centrist perspective. And the other really important outcome of this election is that moderation was not really the key in regaining the vote of the angry people. And my third point is that Biden's victory basically rests on three different processes. The first one is the homecoming, the victory of the three Midwestern states that were lost by Hillary Clinton in 2016. So I'm speaking again about Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. The second process is the victory of Georgia, and the third one is the victory of Arizona. And it's important to take into consideration these three processes because they are important if we want to take a closer look on how different demographic segments have actually casted their ballot. And in the case of Midwestern state, I mean, the Biden reconquest is modest when compared to the magnitude of the 2016 defeat, because Biden wins only by 0.6%. So it's really a small margin. And also opinion on the real nature of this victory are not really clear, because there is a difference about the margin of victory in if we take into account from one side big cities, and on the other, instead, if we take into account the small cities. For example, in Madison, in Wisconsin, Biden wins with 75% of the vote and about 43,000 more votes than unexpectedly Trump earns a few votes in the same cities, and this is true for the same Madison, because for example in Madison Trump was able to get 7,000 votes more than in the previous competition. And speaking of Midwestern state, Trump was able not only to also consolidate his position in rural counties, but also to gain some votes among Latinos, and I mean male Latinos and Afro-Americans male of the cities. And this of course made the battle between the Democrats and the Republican even more difficult. And however, speaking always of Midwestern state, Biden was able to grow in the suburbs that were conquered by Hillary Clinton. And so this is the confirmation of a previous tendency. And digging further, it's also evident that the white vote of this state was less, Trumpian, even regardless of educational qualification, because while male without a degree remain firmly in the Republican camp, on the other side, they scale back the consensus for Trump just enough to give him a defeat. And this was evident, for example, in Wisconsin, but not in Pennsylvania. Second, second geographical area which is important, second say Georgia. This is a very small victory for Democrats because actually they won by a 0.3% margin, but is still an historic victory, not only for the segregationist tradition of the state, but also because the narration of the new democratic organizational model was around about Georgia. This democratic organizational model was the one basically built by Stacey Abrams, which is a voting rights activist, and she is a former member of the Georgia House of Representatives. And here in Georgia, organizations such as Fair Fight, the new Georgia Project, Fair Count, were able to increase the number of people who actually registered for the vote. And here the vote reached record levels. And for example, early voting has grown of 40% among African American in the state. On a global level, the vote has increased by 80.5%. And so this was an important result. For Arizona, for example, here there is again the theme of Latin vote. And in the Italian press, basically it was said that in 2020 was the year of the shift of the Latin votes toward Trump, which, yes, it took place at the national level, but in a very modest percentage term. And I mean, the majority of Hispanic continue to vote the Democratic Party. And the other things that it's important is that usually the Italian press tend to treat the Latin Latin people as a really monolithic bloc, which is not true, because, for example, the Latin from Cuban descendant, which actually live in Florida, are tend to vote for the Republican Party, of course, and the Latin vote, I mean, the Latins are conservative from the, you know, ethical issue, for example, about I mean, about gay rights, for example, but they are less conservative on economic issue, of course, for example, the issue of minimum wage. So the question of the Hispanic vote is more controversial than, especially the journalistic account of trend about Hispanic vote. And yeah, it's probably when we will have the definitive result, this will help us in understanding better this demographic trend. I think, one of my last point, this polarization was ideological and also geographic. For example, Mark Marrow of the Brookings Institution has underlined that there is a huge distance between the economists of Trump and the economists of the electorate pro-Biden, meaning that if in 2016 the counties that voted for Clinton generate 64% of the country gross domestic product, in 2020 the counties that voted for Biden were able to generate 70%, and those pro-Trump just 30%. And the division among the territories of the United States did not vote in a way that was homogeneous, and because there is less interaction between Republican and Democrats. And the other important element is that in the Republican Party, the conservative increased 76% against 45% in 1974, and at the same time moderates decreased in the same party, while for the Democratic Party the liberals went from 28% to 59% if we compare this dynamic, this trend, always with 1974. And so again, there is a huge polarization in the American electorate, and the fear of the counterpart increased. And was the fear of the counterpart that actually was able in bringing to the polls voters that were mobilized in a negative sense. I mean, it was the fear for what the counterpart represent and can do more than the positive hope, the positive image of a certain governmental program. And the last really important element has to do with the Republican ability to actually expand his electoral basin. This electoral basin was imagined to be not so much expandable than the Democratic one, and this was due because I mean, the electoral vote of Republican is overrepresented, is subject to some sort of overrepresentation. And also because among the Republican, the abstention rate is historically lower than in the Democratic Party. And instead, the Republican vote grows, and this growth was unexpected, and this is again a sign of the polarization. And the last important really data has to do with the correlation between vote and income. And here Trump lose, and with large margin, in all low and medium low income group, and also in the high and very high income groups. I mean, the groups that have more than $200,000 each year. And he wins, and also largely only where these incomes are between $100,000 and $200,000, and these electoral bracelet count for 1/5 of the total voters. And this is a very important fact that also tends to confirm things that were already known about the electoral competition of 4 years ago. Because again, especially in the Italian press, it was really common to hear pundits and journalists commenting on the fact that the Trump victory was due to this, I would say, mythological white working class. But all the analysis of the past 4 years have shown that it was the middle class who was actually behind Trump victory. I mean, a middle class that was earning less than in the past, a middle class which was the first victim of a regressive tax system, and a middle class which was affected but also scared by those dynamics that we connect to global economic integration. And so it's not by chance that Trump had tried to address this middle class with his anti-globalist rhetoric, which is actually a critique of globalization from the right, not from the left, as it was, for example, during the, at the beginning, I mean, it was almost 20 years ago. And still, many parts of the analysis are missing, but the data we have give us a picture of a country which is basically divided and polarized. And again, this due to the polarization that was already going on since Obama election, because as Umberto underlined, I mean, the Obama election was not welcomed by a large swath of the American public opinion. And again, Trump, yes, he has lost the presidential rate, but Trumpism is still alive, and Trumpist narration about this supposed and also unconvincing stolen victory, I think, is going to affect the United States for the following years, and probably it would also cause more and more polarized situation in the country. I think that I'm going to stop now, so thank you.
Thank you, Angela. One thing that you have just said, I totally agree with your analysis and your analysis about Trump and Trumpism as a phenomenon that will last. If we take the presidential approval rates, we see that probably for the first time since they exist, these statistics, the presidential approval of Trump's never changed. It was almost constant for the entire 4 years, which is something strange, which demonstrates that there is a growing polarization within the United States. You oppose Trump from the first day, you continue to oppose Trump until yesterday and maybe until tomorrow. You supported Trump since the beginning, you will continue to support Trump. That being said, are there any questions? The floor is open. Please ask us questions, even on our thoughts for future directions of American foreign policy, the role of the United States in the world. I cannot assure we are able to answer you, but we will try to elaborate a little bit on this. So please. Giancarlo, hi Giancarlo, thank you for the thoughts. E quanto è scritto, Giancarlo? Provoking lecture, could you expand on how you see the future shift of the American political spectrum within both parties? It seems the Republican Party, if it follows this Trumpism trend, is shifting farther and farther to the right. Democrats have a progressive, more leftist movement within the party as well. So presidential candidates may need to appeal to previous opposition voters to secure. Do you think both parties will focus on the more extreme sides or appeal to voters of the other side? Maybe one. Okay, Giancarlo. For the Georgia Senate, which is quite simple to answer, 1-1. I think that the seat from Atlanta, especially because of Stacey Abrams' activism, will go to the Democrats, while the other seat will go to the Republicans. On the general level, I really have no idea. My impression is that Trump will not leave politics, that he will remain as an important player within the Republican Party, because in these 4 years, he was able to convince Republican supporters that he was the true, that he really embodied their thoughts and their fears, contrary to the Republican elites. I think that at the beginning, most of the Republican elite was in opposition to Trump, but by 2 years ago, I would say, only Bush was still in opposition to Trump. I've read and listened to people claiming that it is possible that both parties will implode and that a new center will emerge. I think that it is almost impossible for a number of reasons. I think that Biden will not be effective as a president, just to complete the last part of your question.
Can I just add something more on the possible future development inside the parties? I think that for the Republican Party is really important to underline that, I mean, the truly Republican establishment was never really happy about Trump because of his style, because of his populist style. But now we are actually seeing that this Republican establishment it's not ready to cut the link with Trump because it's convenient from a political point of view, because the Republican establishment know that Trump is still alive, so is basically in some way exploiting the personal, I mean the success of Trump message and Trump nationalist and populist appeal. On the other side, for the Democratic Party, basically we have two different souls, I would say. On one side, moderate centrist strand, which is basically the Biden position. Biden is, I mean, an old dog. I mean, he is a really experienced politician. He will try to govern using a centrist perspective, a centrist politics. And although, I mean, given the division in Congress, it's really possible, I mean, yeah, that is going to rule using executive order, which are not really part of the legislative process, and that can be easily overrun by states, and states, I mean, are going to be run by Republicans. So I think that, yeah, Biden is going probably not, yeah, it's not going to be so effective. And the other soul of the Democratic Party is, of course, the one which is close to Ocasio-Cortez, to the Black Lives Matter movement, and also to the feminist movement, or also to the climate, to the anti-climate, yeah, to the movement, to the environmental movement. And this was true because, I mean, Ocasio-Cortez and also Ed Markey, which is another experienced politician. For example, they put together the so-called Green New Deal, which is actually kind of a radical proposal, including also the theme of environmental justice. I'm sorry, I was too long.
Come on, don't worry. We have a question from Francesca Nolli, then a question from Ilaria, a question from Andrea Fracasso, a new message from Riccardo Casiraghi. So I will follow this order. Francesca Nolli is asking a question on how we can explain the shift in Georgia, and my answer to this question is what Angela said, that there was a huge activism by minorities, and especially the Black minority, which went to vote probably for the first time in such a large number. I don't know, Angela, if you want to add anything to this.
I think this is the main reason. There was a huge grassroots effort in order to bring people to the ballot. I mean, also because minority people historically tend to vote less than, for example, white people. So I think, yeah, this is the reason.
Ilaria Signori is asking a question on the possibility of pardon of President Trump should he be convicted. I don't know, actually, Ilaria. I wouldn't be so much surprised, actually. One of the reasons why I think that Trump is making so much noise about the fraud is that he probably is looking for a sort of political agreement to exit. And this political agreement could be about a pardon should he be convicted. But this is just a very personal idea. Angela, I don't know if you share my thoughts.
I mean, I think, yeah, can be an explanation, but I'm less optimistic than you. I really think that Trump is not going to leave the American political scene. I mean, if he's going to leave, he still has this son, which is really active, which has really involved in the electoral campaign, and which was really vocal in sending the same message of the father. So we will see, because really Trump is in a lot of trouble, as you said, from the point of view of investigation. So the most convenient solution for him is to try to stay there, basically.
Andrea Fracasso, please.
So thank you very much for the discussion, the presentation, a number of points, very interesting. So I think that I find particularly interesting this idea of negative mobilization that you very well explained. And in a sense, I was thinking that perhaps if that is true, you have more path dependency in the people voting behavior. So if it is so important, the path dependence, then to a certain extent, it seems to me that what happens in a month, the legal issue, the little problem, the scandal cannot have much an effect. And I think that, you know, this is a different way of looking at politics. And this is the question that I want to make. You presented the results, contrasting them with the expectations by the pundits and the forecasters. And as you said, well, they were right in the sense that Biden would have won, and Biden actually won, but for the wrong reasons. Actually, they didn't get exactly the mechanisms behind the voting system. So just wonder whether people, the pundits, the political scientists, and to a certain extent the press, lost track of what the American people, to a certain extent, think and you know, base their voting the decision upon, like in Italy, more or less.
This is a terrific and terrible question, I would say, because you asked this question about the political scientists' foresight capabilities to historians, and you know quite well that historians have polemics with political scientists. So I will try to be as polite as possible. Yeah, you're right. Pundits, experts, political scientists, analysts have lost track of what is going on in the society. My impression, I spent a lot of words on these aspects of conspiracy theory, because my impression is that these identity politics and these ideas, general ideas about society and vision about society and the other society, are running deeply into the American society and probably also in all Western societies, and can explain a lot of the huge gap between expectation and the idea that electors are rational, behave rationally, and the real outcome.
Yes, I agree basically with Umberto. Here, the point is that sometimes in this analysis of the electoral expectation, I mean, the problem is that they did not tend to take into consideration, for example, long-term tendency in US society and economy. Because, for example, if you look to the period starting in the United States, basically with the so-called multiple crisis of the 70s, is already clear there that something is changing, that the American society is both Republican and Democratic are taking a really different path, and this really different path imply that they are not agreeing anymore on a common vision, which was based on the idea of some sort of regulated capitalism or liberal democratic system. And these are, for me, is also related to the fact that starting in the 70s, the globalization process started, and the consequences of this process became more and more evident. And this, in some ways, is, I mean, the effect, the economic, social effect of this process sometimes are not taken in, into consideration by political analysts, which tend to look basically just to number and data, and not looking to what is behind these numbers.
Riccardo Casiraghi, do you think that the Biden administration will be able to deeply reform the healthcare system? No. No, because of the polarization of the thin majority the Democrats will have in Congress, and because actually I do not think that it will risk everything on the health system, although it is important for Democrats and for him in particular. Giancarlo makes another point on the fact that you're right. Thank you, Giancarlo. You're perfectly right that the president, the former president, can be pardoned should he be convicted only for federal crimes, while most of the investigations are not related to this. Vasil, thank you for your thoughtful lecture during election day. Most of Americans declare the economic issues to be their top priority. How do you interpret this stance? You're right. I've seen that polls. I've seen also that 2 weeks later, the numbers, the answer to that question changed actually. And the economic was not the top priority, it was the third or the fourth. By the way, of course, economic issues are crucial, are relevant. Clinton won the election in 1992 with a very simple slogan, it's the economy, stupid. That being said, economic issues means everything actually. Everything has an economic side. So everything could be relevant from this perspective. If we're talking about jobs, taxes, they will be crucial. Economic relations with the world will be crucial. My impression is that the answer, economic issues are the top priorities, implies two different kind of answers. On the one side, we can see people voting for economic purposes because they do not want to pay more taxes. Retired people in Florida or 50 Cent, the singer, he claimed that he would vote for Trump because he didn't want to become 20 cents. But at the same time, economic issues means also minimum wage, nice wages, means I want to keep my job. It means that people in Michigan and Wisconsin wanted to vote for Biden because Biden offered them more certainties, more hopes for a nice living standard and a nice wage. But yeah, you're right. This question is a really good question with many possible interpretations, however. Angela, do you want?
Yeah, I think that on the economic issue, something that is probably not going to be changed by Biden is the policy toward China, because the policy toward China is, of course, a question that is related to security issue and concern, but is also really related to trade. And I don't think that Biden is going to change this this approach, which is quite challenging from this point of view. Maybe what is going to change is the trade relation with Europe. Because actually Biden seems to be more inclined to cooperate with the Europeans, not just from the discussion of trade issue, but for example also on the coronavirus emergency. So I mean, I think that at least from the international economic point of view, there is going to be some continuity, if not from the rhetoric point of view, at least from the practical point of view.
Thank you, Angela. We have another question from Diego Di Landomenici. I must confess that I've met Diego a couple of days ago, and I know he's an American citizen and he knows American history better than I do, but that being said, he asked us whether the Supreme Court will, this very conservative Supreme Court, will play a significant role. I do think that the Supreme Court will be a sort of stop on any initiative the White House, on any huge grand design initiative the White House will undertake. This is one of the reasons why I think that Biden will not intervene drastically on existing legislation. He will follow unfortunately, will follow many of Trump's initiatives, and I do not see a court acting like the Lochner era, like the court did in the Lochner era, because of the political divisions within the United States, and I doubt that the court will be so stupid as to act so radically. But at the same time, you're right. We have an overrepresentation of Catholics within the Supreme Court. I think that now there are 6 or 7 Catholic judges within the court. And I do think that it will be an extremely conservative counterpower to Biden, but at the same time, Biden's agenda will not be so leftist, so unbalanced, so tilted toward the left as we expected a few weeks and months ago. Mario, thank you. I wanted to ask your opinion on the role of the current identity politics and speeches in the US. The narrative adopted by the non-Trump supporters stresses the white element privileges, but tends not to take into consideration discrimination among non-white groups, anti-Semitism in the Black communities. So, is it more divisive than inclusive? I do not think that it is divisive. I think that there is a political correctness problem. This is true. The idea that political correctness is a problem is something that emerged in the 90s in the far-right groups, actually. But it became quite important in recent years. If you remember the political struggles about Confederate statues in the US and the attempt to remove the statues, many claim that it wasn't a political correctness excess. And to some extent, they were right. You are right that in Black communities, there is a strong, in some Black communities, there is a strong anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism is one of these other points and forces which run deeply into American history. So I wouldn't emphasize too much this anti-Semitic stance of Black communities, because I think that it is a little bit exaggerated, although it exists. I do think, as you asked at the end of your question, that more white people voted for Trump because of this rhetoric about discrimination against the white communities. I do not think that this discrimination really exists, I must confess. I see your point. I see that there could be some room for these ideas, but I do not see any discrimination against the white within the United States. Angela?
There is, I think, more the perception of white people, of some segment in the white people community of being, mistreated, given the too much political, the use, the overuse of, politically, I'm skipping the term of being politicamente correct. I'm sorry for that. It's quite late. And I think this is, this perception is given also again to Trump rhetoric, to his divisive message, and to his self-representation of the white American being in some way under siege by the minorities communities. I mean, this message was clear when Obama won the election. The Obama victory was perceived as the delegitimization of the white America, and Trump, of course, was able to build his consensus upon this perception of white community losing ground, basically, both from an economic and political point of view.
Thank you, Angela. Two things. First of all, we have to close in 10 minutes because we have a few technical problems. Mario makes a more precise point. I totally misread his question. was referring to non-white men, Black and Latinos, voting for Trump for any eventual anti-Semitic stance. I have no idea, I must confess on this point. Diego, a quick subjective, non-professional opinion. I know plenty of white Americans that will take almost any small inconvenience to them as oppression or discrimination. The fictitious war on Christmas and the negative reactions to being asked to wear masks. Thank you, Diego, for this point. You're right, I see your point. I totally share your impression, especially because you are a more direct feeling. Giancarlo, even Giancarlo is an American citizen, actually. So thank you, Giancarlo. Any other question? No. Okay. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you. Maybe one quick one. Diego, please. You can open your microphone.
Okay, thank you. Maybe this will be quicker. I was just wondering, this is a more speculation, but what do you think in terms of what will happen at the end of Biden's first term? Do you think that he will run again, or that he will step down, or that he will be challenged by someone else within the Democratic Party? And do you speculate that Trump will run again, because he seems intent to do so?
I really have no idea, actually.
But maybe if we look at the age of Biden, I mean, I don't think it's possible that he's going to run again, I guess. I don't know about Trump, but Biden is really, I mean, yeah, is older than Reagan when he took office, so.
Yes, I agree that if for some reason he does run again, then if he's not challenged in the primary, then he would probably lose the election. But just because of his mental capacity and capability of communication seems to be deteriorating. But yeah, it was just a quick question regarding speculation. Thank you.
I have no idea, actually. So I think that Johnson could try to Johnson can try to do something really brilliant, such as trying to become president in the foreseeable future. That being said, so it's 7 p.m. Let me thank you all for this talk and for your questions and for listening to us. Special thanks to Angela Santese that accepted this invitation and gave us her thoughts and ideas and interpretations on how Americans voted these November elections.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye. I don't know if we have any official announcements for next...
No, just thank you very much for participating. Thank you, Angela, and everybody. We will have 1 week off, with exception on Monday, with the meeting with Club Albac and EU Arms. And then we will have a series, actually, of meetings, 3 or 4 in December. So please have a look at the announcements and on the website. Thank you again, Umberto, for organizing this.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Angela.
Cool. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Angela, ciao.